back 30 years if you were alive at the time. A lot of young people now just read about it in the history books. But this is the place where the United Democratic Front was formed on a national platform. It had been gathering and it had been making strides regionally, but they all came together here, more than 10,000 people in this little room. I don't know how they fitted, but we're going to find out exactly what it was like, what the atmosphere was like, and what it meant for the fight against apartheid in that time. Just before the break, we heard from Dr. Popo Malifa, who was one of the key figures in the formation of the UDF, and he shared his thoughts with us. But I've got now a panel that I'd like to introduce, both here and also in Johannesburg, of some figures who have an experience of the UDF as well, in one form or another. And one of them is the Minister of Human Settlements, Ms. Connie September. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Next to you, Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Marius Fransman. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. And once again, Dr. Popo Malifa, thank you so much indeed for joining us. And in our studio in Johannesburg, we have senior ANC NEC member Jesse Duarte, who's in studio and will be joining us from Johannesburg as part of this conversation. A very warm welcome to you as well. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure the viewers at home can see you and are acknowledging you. Thank you so much for joining us. In fact, in about 5 or 6 minutes' time, my colleague Sam Marshall will have a conversation with her as well. All right, so let's come back here, though, and get some thoughts from our panel here. Minister, you were here in this room. I'm not sure if you can remember where you sat, but how on earth were you able to fit so many people at that time? What was it like?
Thank you, Peter, and good morning to all the listeners and the viewers, and indeed to all the great UDF leaders that we have in the room here today. I was looking around to see where exactly, well, we didn't sit, we had to stand, all of us. And my memory goes back to when Helen Joseph had to speak. We felt it was important that we had to be in the room. And my one friend, she was a social worker, and she said, I'm a social worker because Helen Joseph was a social worker. And so the two of us, in our smallness that we were, managed to slide through the crowd and was able to get into somewhere on this end. But no doubt the beams that you see here, they were the seats. They were the things that people were hanging on to, and this place was then able to bring in these many thousands. Of course, adjacent and in the outside, there were tents that were put up also. But for us, it was important to be inside of this building and not necessarily in the tent, and that's how we managed to get in here.
Wow, we'll relive some of those moments a bit more. The UDF really impacted, Deputy Minister Fransman, this region and this area in particular, particularly in the years that followed. How did it change the game for the people of the Cape Flats, of the Western Cape in general?
No, I think we must admit that it had a revolving process of people starting to say something must be done. There's issues around land issues, there were issues around bread and butter issues, because the UDF essentially related to bread and butter issues, community issues, issues around civil society and all of that. And I think what it was able to do, it attracted, for example, I wasn't at the age of 13 years in 83, I wasn't in this hall. But as we, for example, 84, 85, we started to, for example, get active in that process as young children, in fact, 14 years old and 15 years old. So it was able to generate people in what we would call a popular mobilization. What was critical at that time, as it has gone, having the single focus on dislodging apartheid government. I think that is the experience. If I look at this room, just look at everyone here, you can see a non-racial audience, you can see an inclusive approach, you can see gender parity, you can see people in civil society, in political structures. You can see NGOs, church leaders, you can see the Khoi San community, you can see traditional healers here. So that is essentially what it, and I think that's what the organizers also did today, to bring a resemblance of that solidarity of a movement of a people together. I always advise that we obviously should respect and honor that era, but we must understand it happened in a particular context, in a particular era, and therefore we do have our own challenges. And therefore it is the ability and the maturity of leadership to be provided in this era as well. There was a particular leadership in '83 that understood the society. 30 years thereafter, there's particular new challenges. And in the Western Cape, as the country is already busy with going into a deepening sense of transformation, the Western Cape, we still need to get a transformed structure, because in the provincial government, there's in fact no woman except the Premier. That is not what the UDF stood for. What we are sitting here today is organizations like NICROM and other organizations that were there historically, today are not getting the type of funding by the city and by the province, whilst organizations that tries to bail out certain drug lords and merchants, they are getting funding from the city of Cape Town. That is what, meaning that's not what the UDF stood for. If you look at the CBD of Cape Town, 98%, and this is real, 98% of all property ownership still belong to a few, in this case, the white constituency. That is not what the UDF stood for. And therefore, in a strange, perverse way, the country has moved on and we've got new challenges. Our challenges in the Western Cape, coming from the situation where we're coming from, we were supposed to be much further. This is the province where the first war of resistance took place, led by the Khoisan community. This is the place where we had influx control, where a black African person were not supposed to own a house. Today, we are hearing some people, in this case even the Premier of this province, speaks about refugees. Okay. Uncoded is very problematic, and I think we are still in a minimum program of action, Comrade Popo. As the UDF had a minimum program of action, we in the Western Cape have a minimum program of action through what the provincial secretary will call Path to Power.
Okay, all right. So a lot of thoughts that you've shared with us in the opening remarks there. Dr. Malifa, I want to come back to you actually, because you said you spoke at the disbanding of the UDF, and you raised a question. You says we need to ask ourselves today, how far have we come since '83, and what have we done since? And my question to you perhaps is, should the UDF then perhaps have carried on rather than been disbanded, and maybe had a different mandate rather than to disband it, in retrospect now?
No, Peter, I don't think the UDF should have carried on. We started our people on bread and butter issues. And we knew that the principles that underpinned the working principles of the UDF, because the UDF didn't have a thing called the Constitution. It had a thing called the working principles. That was a document that articulated the key principles in the Freedom Charter. But we didn't want to say that we want people to be adopt the Freedom Charter. We didn't adopt it ourselves until only 1987. If I recall, no, it was adopted by COSATU actually. But by the time the ANC got unbanned, the vast majority of the organizations in the UDF had adopted the Freedom Charter. They were aligning themselves with the vision of the African National Congress. And the Nelson Mandela that for whose release we were fighting for had come out of jail. The ANC that we believe was the champion of our struggle for freedom had been unbanned, so was the PAC and others. And so we said, look, now that the organization that should have led this country are unbanned, let's put all our forces together and build that movement, because we have to realize that vision which is pioneered by the African National Congress. So it was proper for us to do so. But I think we needed to continue in a skillful way to find the balance in the diversity of views that characterized our society, which the UDF was able to do so well. We would not demand that the church must agree with everything that we were doing in the party, but we knew that there were specific things that they would agree with us on ending poverty, on giving houses to our people, because that's what their own congregants want, on ensuring that we fight crime, on ensuring that we have proper elected leaders. So that balance enables us to work together in the movement, and we succeeded in doing so. Okay. It's not like we never used to have serious tensions in the days of the UDF. If Connie and Marius, you remember the December 1983 conference at the Feather Market Hall in Port Elizabeth, we had a very difficult situation when we had to find a balance between principles, strategy, and tactics on how we would deal with the then mooted referendum for Indians and colored. Do we mobilize the Indians to demonstrate that they don't want the Constitution by voting no, or do we simply say we're boycotting, and the regime takes a few people who go to that referendum and say, but people have voted yes, because the majority would have kept out. So I know I'm straying away, yes, because I'm carried away. But what I'm saying is that it was a correct decision,
but isn't
to close the UDF.
What you're saying, isn't that further cementing the idea that maybe it didn't need to be a movement that was similar to the one that was formed to fight apartheid, etc., but more about finding common ground between the different parties? Because at the moment, one gets a sense that it's us and them, whichever party you belong to, whichever movement you belong to. Whereas in those days, you said, let's find our common ground and work together to build our country. Maybe that's what we need now.
Yeah, Peter, actually we had tried that. If you think, before we went to the election, even the adoption of the interim constitution in 1993, remember we formed what we called, I think we called it the Patriotic Front. We brought in these Bantustan leaders, Bantustan parties, PAC, ZAPO, Black Consciousness. I said, look, guys, we now are going to work for the creation of a new South Africa. We've all been oppressed. We've all been fighting for this freedom. Let's work together. That's what our President Nelson Mandela did, and President Oliver Tambo at the time. And we brought all these people together. And then we said the wounds of divisions have run so deep in this country. In the first term of government, let's form a government of national unity. Let's all work together to govern this country. We're not going to have a situation of the winner take all. Even the manner in which we designed the electoral system and wanted it to be a proportional representation system with provinces and local authorities with measure of autonomy, it was intended that there should be a broad participation by all parties. So we really did that. It's important that those who govern and who are in political parties must keep going back to our past to say, are we still staying the course? Are our actions helping to unite our people? Or are our actions causing our people to veer away from one another in a racial manner that does not help to build the essence of nationhood and that patriotism that we want? So in a sense, what we should be calling for today, Peter, it should be appealing to a sense of patriotism in all South Africans, to say, hey, we don't want what we happened in the past. We stopped what was happening to us in the past. Let's all put our shoulders to the wheel and achieve that better society, that better and sustained dignity of our people that we have always yearned for. Let's work together. It doesn't matter whether you are a DA or what. Work for that genuine South Africa that restores the dignity of our people. It doesn't matter whether you're Cope or you're anybody. Let's work for that.
Okay. All right, what we'd like to do now is cross to Johannesburg, and Sam, I think you can pick up the conversation with Jesse Duarte, who's sitting next to you.
Thanks, Peter. And I think maybe one of the questions we do want to pick up on is one that you asked, and I'm going to throw this in two parts. Let's first get maybe a response from Mam Jesse Duarte, who's the African National Congress Deputy Secretary General, joining us here in our Johannesburg studios. There was a question that Peter asked Minister Myers Fransman about game changers. The fact that Mitchell's Plain at that stage in Rocklands was the central venue for the UDF. It's often underlooked in terms of the role that Mitchell's Plain has played in our liberation struggle.
Well, Mitchell's Plain was the host of the launch of the UDF, but also a number of civic and different organizational groups grew out of Athlone, Mitchell's Plain and areas like that. You had a combination of the Muslim community, you had Christian communities coming in various formations, women's groups. Of course, the most solid one was the Western Cape UCO, the United Women's Congress. Connie and Lynn Brown and people like that were part of UCO. And looking at ordinary issues that faced women was the mobilization tool, as we did in other parts of the country as well. In the Transvaal, we had the Federation of Transvaal Women. We had the Natal Organization of Women. We had in Port Elizabeth a women's organization. Primarily, the issues of the day were repression. There were political assassinations on an ongoing basis. People were being killed. It was during the UDF's period that the PEPCO 5 were killed. It was, David Webster was shot down and killed in that period during the 80s. So Mitchell's Plain was the growth point of this wonderful feeling of a South Africa that had one mission, and that was to defeat apartheid. We did have detractors. I want to tell you that straight up front. I mean, not only the National Party did not welcome the emergence of the UDF. There were many other communities who felt that things should not change. Those communities found expression today in different political formations, but at the time, it was a formidable formation of as broad a section of society towards ending apartheid, and at the same time, mass mobilization in terms of bringing about a sense that this country, the people of South Africa, rejected apartheid without any question mark. And we had Comrade Nelson Mandela as one of the key figures. We had the Release Nelson Mandela campaign. So, and the release of other political prisoners. I must say to you, Sam, one of the things that was very good was a number of former political prisoners, like Popo, Molefe, Terra Likota even, with the leadership of the UDF. So these were people who had a strong sense of a Congress background. There was no doubt about where their allegiances were. And for that reason, I think the Freedom Charter was an automatic inclusion in the UDF. I remember taking the Freedom Charter to universities and workshopping with university students. What were the elements of this Freedom Charter? Ultimately, the prospect of human dignity was at the core of what took place in the 80s.
Let me get a reaction there, because 700 organizations had one united goal back then. A question that Peter asked Dr. Popo Molefe was, should the UDF have continued, carried on, maybe in a different guise, or something with maybe with a more cultural attachment to it? Just your reaction to his answer?
Well, I wanted to agree with Dr. Popo Molefe. I don't think so. I think that ultimately when the ANC was unbanned, the UDF had done what it could have done to mobilize the people of South Africa. Now was the time for more solid political engagement on the ground. And you know, democracy is an interesting animal. it allows people to choose very fundamentally the direction they would like to go in from a political perspective. And it's not, we can have similar goals in a democracy, and certainly the National Development Plan is one such proposal on the table at the moment, is a plan for South Africa. But we can also disagree vehemently on a number of issues. And that's the check and the balance that you get in a democracy. If we simply all agreed with each other all the time, that would be wonderful. But at the same time, would we have this oversight? Would we have the prospects of us looking at one another and being able to point out where you are not doing things correctly? Loyalty to a political formation is very important. But at the same time, what Dr. Molefe says should be a common goal for all of us is, can we all work towards human dignity? We don't have to be in the same political party to do so. We can in fact be in different political parties and have that one small goal.
Let's talk about loyalty very, very quickly as a
Sure.
follow-up. Last year we had this UDF relaunch. I spoke to the UDF convener, Mario Wanza, from our Cape Town studio, and towards the end of that conversation, he sounded quite aggrieved that this party is not part of this celebration. What is your reaction to the goals back then and the relaunch of the UDF last year?
You know, the launch of the UDF was a wonderful moment in the history of our country, where hundreds of thousands of people throughout the country had made a commitment towards ensuring that we end apartheid, towards ensuring that all the atrocities of apartheid become unbundled. We then move into the 1990s, and the ANC is unbanned, the PAC is unbanned, and so on. All the liberation movements are unbanned. And anybody has the right to form a political organization in South Africa, but you must have a platform. And if your platform is acknowledged and accepted by people, that's your right to do so. So the UDF that was relaunched last year launched itself on a premise of a political formation. Now, I think that they could have been included, I'm not sure, but they can't be related to the UDF that was launched those many years ago. It's wrong. I think that you can't own a piece of history, you slice it out and you say, I'm going to keep it for myself. You know, the UDF that was launched in Rocklands is the United Democratic Front that was launched for a particular purpose. I was never sure why this UDF of last year was launched, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to be very articulate on that.
Ma'am, can we leave it there? That, of course, is the African National Congress Deputy Secretary General, Jessie Duarte, sharing her thoughts for now. We might come back to her just a little bit later. Let's